So nice to be here, and that last session was wonderful. I don't know if you guys have a chance to tune in. Welcome to everyone who's joining us virtually, too. First, I want to welcome you to Detroit. This is a wonderful city, and I want us to ground our conversation outside of the Renaissance Center, but actually in the vibrancy of our city. Detroit has a really long history of the arts. We have a long history of industry, of activism and philanthropy. Detroit has a long history of change, some that's been creatively driven and some change that has been foisted on the city and relentless in nature. Detroiters have seen it all. So they've seen empires that have been built, and they've seen them fall. They've seen land grabs, municipality grabs, power grabs. Detroiters throughout have been here and have created their own. There has always been, and there continues to be, so much beauty in this city. There's so much functionality, there's so much design innovation, there's community benefit, there's mutual aid, and it's not in spite of this context, but it is because of it, and it's in the face of it. I'm wondering if this microphone is creating a problem. So philanthropy, I want to be really clear, this term, this care of humanity, is owned first and foremost by community, not by the industrial philanthropic sector that we do represent and that we're going to talk about today. And activism is really a part of Detroit's history, and it is also owned first and foremost by community. Today, you are in a Detroit that is in the midst of transforming, and some may say is in a bit of a fight for its soul. It isn't the same city that it was 11 years ago, in 2013. And it won't be the same city 11 years from now, in 2035. But whose city will it be? Who will determine this choice? Whose ideas will design it? Inside the city of idea makers and hustlers and creatives, there's a familiar divide that you may also see in the places where you have come from. That divide is across geography, it is across class, it is across ideology, and the sides and sectors of Detroit overlap, but they may not always work together. The slogan, Detroit versus everybody, though, is universally accepted. And everyone in the city unites around this. It is a call out to the non-believers. It is a call out to the doubters. Artists here have long been in the center of this discussion, and philanthropy, always for better or worse, seems to have a seat at the table. What do we do with that seat? What do we do with the other tables that are being set? I'm Angelique Powers. I'm the president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation, which is based here in Detroit. I am not a native Detroiter. I have transitioned from being deeply in the arts a few years ago to move here and to work on creating that interstitial space between those sectors, between those perceived divides. The Skillman Foundation focuses on Detroiters, and we link arms with young people, with educators, with policymakers and parents, and we aim at what we see as the biggest hack in creating an equitable future, and that's our public education system. So we work to collectively reinvent it so that it is innovative and customized, culturally relevant, nourishing, reflective of who we are today, and building an adaptive muscle for who we're becoming tomorrow. I've worked for 3 different foundations in the last 15 years, and I've seen many people and many phases come and go. I've met those inside of philanthropy who maintain the status quo. And I've met those who are in philanthropy to disrupt it. Today you meet some of the disruptors. I'm lucky to be joined by two very thoughtful human beings who think differently, who show up differently, and who are putting in place some things that will create a shift beyond a moment or a grant and are deeply rooted in change that honor artists and are in service to a larger ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Lane Harwell and DeAnna Cummings. I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourself and to talk about your foundation, talk about what you do and what you fund, and then also talk about who you are in the work. And we'll start with you.
Thank you, Angelique. Good morning, everyone. I am DeAnna Cummings. I'm the program director of the Arts and Culture program at the McKnight Foundation. The McKnight Foundation is an independent family foundation founded in 1953 by William and Maud McKnight. William McKnight was the longtime CEO of 3M, and the McKnight Foundation is one of the foundations in Minnesota that grew out of the 3M wealth. 3M is still based in Minnesota. McKnight Foundation's mission is to advance a more just, creative, and abundant future where people and planet thrive. The arts program is one of our 4 grant-making programs, and our focus is to support nonprofit organizations who focus on supporting artists. Our strategy is rooted in research that shows that when asked if you believe in the arts, if you think that arts are important, most Americans will say, yes, arts are one of the most important things in our society. If you ask people if they value artists, most people would say, kinda, a little bit. So McKnight's focus is increasing the value we give artists. We support about 150 nonprofit organizations, including our support of 14 intermediary partners who provide about 45 fellowships a year to individual artists. And we support fellowships across a diverse range of disciplines, from book artists to ceramicists to musicians, choreographers, dancers, etc. And with that, I will say again, good morning. I look forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it over to Lane.
Thank you. Hello, Detroit. Very nice to be with you this morning. Honored to be on this distinguished panel and to have been dubbed a disruptor, which feels maybe a little bit too generous. I'm Lane Harwell. My pronouns are they, he. Just a short visual description. I'm a white, queer, femme person with non-visible disabilities. I'm a vision in gray today to match the weather. I have long hair up in a swoop. I've got big glasses on. I'm newly a senior program officer of creativity and free expression at the Ford Foundation, which just means to me that I've become an elder, which is just stunning to me. I enter philanthropy as a dancer, as an artist, as a scholar, cultural worker, and a nonprofit leader. I founded and led a service organization for the dance field for almost a decade before I joined Ford 5.5 years ago. We were just talking about that. Ford is a large global foundation focused on tackling inequality in all of its forms. It originated in Detroit in the 30s and is now headquartered in New York. The unit that I'm a part of, Creativity and Free Expression, includes a journalism portfolio, a film portfolio, and an arts portfolio united in a commitment to push back against entrenched cultural narratives. Our vision is a future where artists are abundant and thriving, and helping us imagine the potential of a multiracial, disability, and gender-just democracy. The arts portfolio it's a multi-arts portfolio. We fund national efforts, and we fund regional efforts in areas that are culturally rich and funding poor, including the American South and Indian country. We have a robust portfolio in Detroit and are a proud supporter of Sphinx. Thanks.
Thank you. We each described the organization where we work and what our organization does and the mission or the focus, which is a big part of why we're there. You make choices based on a values alignment. But going back to the disruptor title, once you enter into philanthropy, you have a choice of how you approach the work, how you approach grantees, how you approach funding decisions, rubrics, metrics, and sometimes I think we look at it like there's a finite period that you're going to be in this space. What are you going to do with it? When we first met, we talked about this, the title of this session, Activism in Philanthropy, which was handed to us. And we said, you know, can we claim this? So I want to reset that question to ask you both, as individuals who work in philanthropy, what is your revolution? Lane.
Me, Lane, okay. I really love this topic, activism in philanthropy. It's kind of abstract, but it's got me thinking, and I will embrace the descriptor. Activism, thank you, New Oxford American Dictionary, is one who campaigns for political or social change. And I certainly believe that the arts are integral to social change. I see that cultural power, economic power, and cultural power intersect. I believe that culture precedes policy, and I've seen that happen. And I certainly fund with that in mind. So I'd say that I think it feels funny to put activism and philanthropy together. By joining philanthropy, I became part of a capitalist system that is built on stolen land and stolen labor and concentrates power and resources in the hands of a few. In a sense, I then became the man. I'm doing air quotes now. So how can one be part of a system and also an activist, I think is a provocative question. On the other hand, Angelique offers that in philanthropy there are some who maintain the status quo, and when I have heard myself described as an activist by them, it's not a compliment, right? And it means that I'm maybe pushing for too much change. And I don't like to be, I like to be liked, so that's one thing that I struggle with. But I also really try to practice patience, and I try to practice adaptive leadership, which means pushing for change, yes, absolutely, but also pushing for change at the rate people can stand. So we have options in philanthropy for how we can affect change. And one way is to think about the change we can affect in our own institutions and also the broader philanthropic ecosystem. So how do we increase access, transparency, ground decision-making in community, keep pushing for flexible general support And certainly, Ford is very open and aligned with those commitments. We also have the option of focusing externally. So we just can try to get the dollars out the door to change makers in the world so that they can make the change we want to see happen. And at Ford, I would say I've done a bit of a balancing act. I'm not sure I've always gotten it right, where I focus my attention, but I've tried to focus on where I can have the biggest impact. And I have focused significantly internally. And that's because Ford is large and it has many moving parts, and I've seen opportunity for change, and I'll name here, I mean, my revolution, what a big question. A multiracial, disability, and gender-just democracy. So it is, Ford's revolution is my revolution, and I've had the opportunity to organize at Ford its participation in Grantmakers United for trans communities and to push for LGBT justice across many program areas, not just the program area that I'm in. So that's one way that I have focused on change internally. I'd also just say that I entered philanthropy. I'd be curious to hear where you sit in this timeline too, both of you, but at a moment of intense self-interrogation. And I joined Ford in large part because of my deep respect for its president, Darren Walker, who has spoken about, and there's a book even, moving from generosity to justice. And what that means to me is acknowledging the sources of wealth, acknowledging one's privilege, and giving that privilege up. And for me, that means making sure that I am decentered, to quote our last panel, as much as possible in the decision-making, to make sure that decision-making is grounded in communities most impacted by inequality. And so I think I would just offer that for me, activism in philanthropy looks like giving privilege up.
Beautiful.
DeAnna.
And Lane, I'd piggyback on that comment to share with the audience that when we talked about this idea of activism in philanthropy, we admittedly had to say, in our jobs, we can only be as activist as the company that we work for will allow, right? Because if we're too activist, we lose our jobs probably, right? So this idea of being a disruptor is something that I can sort of get my head around versus this idea of I'm an activist. In terms of the revolution, to Angelique's question that I'm interested in, I'm gonna go back to something I said earlier, which is changing the way we think about support for artists. I came into this job 3 years ago. I started on June 1st of 2020, which was the Monday after the uprisings that started in Minneapolis because of George Floyd being murdered. We were all working remotely, some of you may remember, so I literally opened up my laptop at my kitchen table, and I was the director of the Arts and Culture program at McKnight. I came to the work having founded and led a nonprofit arts and culture center, Juxtaposition Arts, in Minnesota for a couple of decades. So I came to the work, and I was hired in part because I have a sensibility like the practitioners that I support. So I come not as someone who has decades of experience in philanthropy, but someone who has decades of experience as a practitioner running an arts and culture organization. I say that because what was surprising to me when I came to McKnight was that Juxtaposition Arts was one of a handful of BIPOC led organizations in Minnesota that has been in existence for decades. often when we're doing the work of running a nonprofit organization, sort of our heads are down. And I thought that there were many organizations like Juxta across Minnesota. And when I came to McKnight and looked at our portfolio and realized that we are the only Black-led organization with a budget of over $1 million that owns its own building in Minnesota. And of the 165 organizations that McKnight funds, we are the only. And part of that is because our approach to funding and philanthropy has tended to be that we need to find the best and the brightest in our sector and fund them. So this idea of watering the tallest trees, finding them, and supporting them is really the approach we take to funding the arts and philanthropy. My revolution is about helping folks to understand the arts as a natural resource in our communities, right? So if we think about the arts as a natural resource and we use the metaphor of a forest, it's important that the entire forest be watered and nourished in order to get the tallest trees. So helping people to understand arts and artists as a natural resource. Artists in Minnesota are paid approximately 50% of the median income of other workers. And my question is, if artists are able to do all that they can do in Minnesota, and I would argue that part of the reason why the uprisings that happened because of George Floyd's murder happened in Minnesota is in part because we have a robust, active arts and cultural community. So if they can do that at 50 cents on the dollar of a median income of everyone else, what would happen if they got the full dollar? What could happen in Minnesota and what could happen in this country? So that's my revolution.
I love this concept of art as a public good. And Lane, you also talked about what that means in your work. How do you approach ecosystem?
I love this natural resource idea, so thank you for that. The other frame that I love is it's a rights frame that experiencing art and creating art are fundamental human rights, and this is how the UN talks about the role of arts and culture, so that's another. And I also often use the frame of public good, and in that frame, the arts are worthy of investment and protection. And just a little context for this is that it's part of its mission to tackle inequality. Ford has identified key drivers of inequality. And they include entrenched cultural narratives that undermine tolerance, fairness, and inclusion, unfair rules of the economy, unequal access to government, persistent prejudice and discrimination, and a failure to invest in and protect public goods. And in the public goods bucket, one can think about education, one can think about natural resources, and I would, offer up the arts as a public good. And when one looks at the arts ecosystem, at the individual, at the organizational, and at the systemic level, one sees these key drivers of inequality impacting the field. The artists who are elevated, the voices that are elevated, who gets to work, where the dollars flow. And what gets me energized in my work is thinking about how we address the root causes of inequality. I'm interested in the arts as an ecosystem, yes, but I also understand that it's an ecosystem that's connected to other movements and to democracy. The arts don't stand alone. So what this means for me in practice is interrogating and funding at the intersections of the arts, future of work, the arts and technology, the arts and climate, the arts and civic engagement. And I'll just, to give you an example of this kind of work, is that I'm collaborating across 2 programs at Ford, Civic Engagement in Government, and our Gender, Ethnic, and Racial Justice team, which has an immigrant rights portfolio, on a Reclaiming the Border Narrative initiative. And that initiative is investing in immigrant rights organizations to build their cultural muscle, to build creative strategy, to work with creatives on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to invest deeply in border artists and writers to tell their story. And I think it's a useful model. What I want to see is I want to see creative strategy and creatives embedded in every social justice movement. I want to see the arts as integrated everywhere. And when one thinks about the arts as a public good, that frame of a public good, I think it unlocks opportunity for advocacy at the federal level, at the state level, at the municipal level. It opens up opportunity for deeper collaboration between philanthropy and government, and I'll shout out the NEA and the White House and wonderful Maria Rosario Jackson, who you've heard from last night, who is thinking about that kind of integration. Thinking about the arts as a public good unlocks opportunity for deeper investment and for participation and amplifying the power of the arts.
Thank you. I'm going to let everyone know that I'm going to go to questions shortly, right after I ask this last question. We want to give more time. There were such spicy, good questions in the last session. So let me just say, for the virtual audience tuning in, and also for folks in the room, you can ask questions either at the mic, and we'll alternate. You can also ask questions via the Sphinx app in the Q&A section of the REN Live tab with the access code REN. So part of what happens, even though each of you came from nonprofits, and I did too, when you move into philanthropy, you become a dollar sign. And you may not know it. I mean, you may not acknowledge it, but everybody else knows it. And so what does that mean for your work? Especially because we met when you were at Juxtaposition. And so how do you handle being in community, but not of community, or of community while you're in community? What does that mean for you?
So I still think of myself as being of community, in community, and I work in philanthropy. I think as more of us come into the sector who are of community, of the communities that we support, I think this sort of binary between funders and grantees is becoming less of a binary. And at the same time, I think it does us no good, nor the artists and culture bearers we support any good, if we deny our power. And I have to say that as I came into philanthropy, it was surprising to me the number of people and organizations in this sector who really sort of back away from their power, deny their power, present as if, well, you know, we don't make the decisions, it's up to our community to decide, when the reality is we actually do decide, and we are gatekeepers in many ways. So sort of acknowledging that, owning that, and then being thoughtful about how we use the power for good in service of the mission that we're all seeking to accomplish. So I don't think it needs to be a binary, and I think that community sort of can come to that understanding as well if we're honest right out of the gate about our power. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I don't know, it's just You don't know who your friends are anymore because everybody is so nice to you, right? It just changes it. It just changes everything. And then you also, I mean, you no longer are a human being, right? Somehow and there's just this idea that philanthropy is a monolith, right? It's not. Our foundations are not the same, and these foundations are led by people, right? And I think the framing has been helpful here, and the invitation to show up as individuals, right? And it's a helpful reminder, to us, I'm Lane, I'm at the Ford Foundation is a different frame from, I'm Lane and this is how I'm, showing up and I'm feeling today. And I think that having these conversations where we're humanized, right, it can be helpful on both sides of the page. But, I also have seen a shift in philanthropy and who's hired, right? And there's some foundations that make this a priority to bring in people from the ground, and so I commend those foundations who do it. I believe that every good grant maker has also been a grant seeker.
Yeah.
And that it means that they have empathy. It also means that they can feel in their body the kind of positional privilege, that they have, and they can open up. I think what I'm hearing from you, and it's so helpful, right, is that we do have power and we have privilege. We have to own it, right? While at the same time, I've seen, my work at Fort is how do we decenter my voice? How do we decenter the foundation's voice? This has really been my commitment. How do we bring in other voices in the decision making, and what that means is that we've invited artists, leaders, particularly those most impacted by inequality, to make recommendations to us for our grant making. Where the power rests is that we're setting that frame, right? And empowering those in the field who are taking initiative around philanthropy as advocates for philanthropy, in building mutual aid projects, in building re-grant projects, artist-led. I'll call out just Constellations, which is a project of Center for Cultural Power in collaboration with many others that we've been excited to invest in. And I entered philanthropy, as you did, DeAnna, with a community of outsiders that I've carried with me. And I have met many other amazing people. But I'm always aware that there's enormous gaps, right, in my network. And so I tell myself my daily affirmation is be curious. Be curious, and then be proximate, right? And be open to learning, and try to just continue to expand that frame, the orbit of who you bring into the work. And part of that is also, DeAnna and I were just speaking now about how we connected right when she started in philanthropy. Part of that is also how do we learn with each other in this space? How do we hold each other, as allies, and introduce each other to our communities? So thank you for the provocation.
Let's see if there are any questions. I have more, but if there are questions from virtually or from the audience, we'd love to hear from you. Go ahead.
Hi, this question is from online, from the virtual audience. This one is, considering your own acknowledgement of professional limitations, how do you engage activists who have paid the price professionally, such as being fired from their jobs?
Would you ask the question again, please?
Absolutely. Considering your own acknowledgement of professional limitations, how do you engage activists who have paid the price professionally?
Well, I would say that in my program, we haven't necessarily identified activists as sort of a group of people that are important for us to engage. But I would say, because we support artists, there tends to be a good number of activists amongst the community of folks that we support. To Lane's point, at the McKnight Foundation, hearing from and being informed by the folk who we are seeking to support is absolutely critical and core to our work. So many of our grant-making decisions are made via panel processes, whereby community members serve as the decision makers for our grant making. We're also testing an idea that removes sort of competition from our grant making process entirely. And we're funding folks in Minnesota who are utilizing a randomized lottery system, because we also recognize that even when community are deciders, not us as professionals in philanthropy, bias is embedded in those processes as well. So I would say that from my side of things, it isn't as much about specifically engaging activists as it is about engaging a diverse range of folks who represent the folks who we intend to support.
At Skillman, we actually are looking at activists. We call them ground builders. And so we are looking specifically at young people, youth power. We have a category there. We're looking at educators, educator power, and then neighborhood power. And we also recognize that it is a partnership that needs to be created between the ground builders and policymakers. And so a big piece of the bet that we're trying to make is like, how does social change actually happen? And it happens, and who is in the room when it happens? Because often it is incredibly thoughtful, well-meaning policymakers or even business leaders who are in these spaces creating these policies, but those that are most impacted and are really the experts on it aren't creating it. And so activists have had a history with philanthropy, with business, and with policymakers that makes them very skeptical about trusting. And so a part of the work, small part, is the grant, but a lot of it is recognizing that we're operating in an ecosystem that does punish people for activism and for truth. And so a lot of harm repair has to happen if you're going to approach activism.
If I heard the question right, it was really specifically about how do we engage those activists who have paid the price for their activism and you know, maybe specifically lost their job, which I think is it's a helpful provocation. Certainly, this is a particular moment in time where there are threats to free expression of all kinds, legislative, donor influence, and we've seen many people lose their jobs just for expressing their views. That has not happened in our portfolio, so I can't speak to that, you know, specifically. But I can say that it's a trend that's worrying and that we're watching, and your ideas for how to support those who have been hardest hit. We are thinking about, you know, how do we create space for learning around the current moment, and specifically this moment around attacks on free expression and whose voices would be centered, and certainly it's those who have been impacted and hit by using their voice that we would want at the table with us. I think it's also, as a foundation, we support arts organizations rather than individuals in most every instance. And so holding our organizations accountable, and one would anticipate deep interrogation of an organization should that issue arise, but certainly also investing in organizations that are activist-led and founded has been a priority in our work.
Hello, my name is Sophie Press. I'm here with the National Symphony Orchestra and the Kennedy Center. And it's been great to hear sort of about the practices that your foundations have implemented, making funding seeking more equitable, general operating dollars, all that great stuff. My question is kind of two parts. One, what are you as individuals or your foundations doing to sort of expand that across the philanthropy sector? You talked about how it's not a monolith. Parts of it are great, parts of it are less great. And then for those of us who work at institutions that wield a lot of power, is there anything we can sort of push back into the philanthropy industry to bring everybody sort of along?
Oh, you're looking at me. No, I really appreciate that point. The way Ford thinks about its role in the field, right, is that there's the grant making that we do, but there's also our convening power and our communications power, and so sort of directly to your point, how we're pushing for change, and specifically the kind of change that's around general operating support and flexible support is something that we're messaging in a regular way, and that we're convening our partners around. And DeAnna and I have collaborated, for example, on an America's Cultural Treasures initiative, which has provided general support to BIPOC organizations across the country that we feel very proud of. We also have seen a shift towards general operating support, and recognize that there are some foundations where there are limits to what's possible there that we keep trying to break down.
The thing I'll say about how can you inside your organization push on philanthropy, I think there are a few things that happened during the pandemic. One, foundations started to work together more, started to break down these silos of how they fund, started to be more responsive to needs, started to give general operating support, and there was a democratization of power. So social media was just as effective as having a high-level donor say something inside of arts organizations as well as toward philanthropy. And so I think that there is still an important conversation about what does transparency look like in philanthropy? What does accountability look like in philanthropy? And if we are in service to community, then how is that evident? Where are the receipts of what that means? And so I do think there's tremendous amount of power in community to ask those questions. It shouldn't be on the development person who is interacting with the foundation person, but I think there are lots of coalitions that are nonprofits that work with philanthropy, and there's tremendous power there. Yes, sir.
Hi. Oh, hi. I'm a program officer at a funder based in the Philadelphia region. We fund arts and heritage work, and I'm new to it as well. I've been there 3 years. And before that, I ran a community arts institution, and had you asked me at that time, should the funder who I come to most often change their goalpost from excellence to community impact, I would have said 100%, yes, do that now. And now that I'm in the role, I still believe that would have been great for the institution that I work with, but I'm hearing from artists and organizations that there's some unintended kind of distortion in moving from an excellence place to a justice place or a something else place, where they feel that their art becomes a how, not a what. And they're no longer enabled to strive for creative excellence as the primary goal of their work. And then you also hear from artists who work from marginalized backgrounds or under-prioritized backgrounds, who then say that they feel a responsibility to enter the room with that identity first in some of these different orientations. Are you guys thinking about the downstream effects or the unintended effects or the displacement in that shift?
Most definitely. And again, I'm going to come back to this sort of place we are in time, which requires us to be able to have two things be true, right? So the binary between either I'm excellent or I'm rooted in community, I think is what we need to work to dissolve. You can be rooted in community and excellent, and vice versa, right? And my response does not dismiss the reality that I hear from artists and arts leaders that funding to just make art is harder and harder and harder to come by, and that philanthropy has really sort of done a hard shift away from making art because it's beautiful and makes us feel good toward making art that does something. And at McKnight Foundation, we believe that we have to do both, right? So when I say that we've shifted and identified a desire to support artists and culture bearers who are advancing justice, that isn't to say that we aren't also going to fund choreographers and composers to just do what they do. So it's a both and again, I think this idea of two things can be true is really critically important for us to keep in mind.
This is such a loaded question. Plus one to breaking down the binary, which is the first thing that I would offer. I also have a point of view, which is it's not all art is good art, and there's art that can do harm, right? There's art that can reify and make stronger entrenched cultural narratives that undermine tolerance, fairness, and inclusion, which is that key driver of inequality that I mentioned. And there's art that can open up new ways of seeing the world. This idea of art for art's sake, I have no interest in this idea. I'm not interested in being comforted or, beautiful is, I love beauty. Beauty is, as I've just read, and why am I blanking on the name of this book, this fabulous book, Chloe, who writes about beauty. The definition of beauty is being fully present, right? So Beyonce is the best example when she performs, so I just love that. But, so I don't want to say it's not about being beautiful, but art needs to be relevant and to matter to people, right, for it to work. Now, this piece about excellence, which I just kind of try to leave that off the table when I'm talking about arts and culture, I'll bring to this project that we've been working on, and I want to talk about this too, America's Cultural Treasures. In the name, America's Cultural Treasures, the idea, which can be contested, it has been by our grantees and by some of us doing this work. The idea was that there were certain institutions of color that have been critical to the cultural fabric of our country that have not been lifted up as treasures and have not been resourced, and that naming them as treasures, right, matters. But this idea of treasures and who's doing the naming and who's excluded from that and how treasure relates to excellence is quite a complicated thing that that we're wrestling with. So I'd love to hear from you, DeAnna, if you have anything to offer there.
That's right, Lane. And Minnesota, the Twin Cities was one of the 20 or so locations around the country that was identified for Ford Foundation funding. McKnight Foundation matched it, and some of our partners did as well. And we took a three-pronged approach. On the one hand, McKnight Foundation named 10 treasures, 10 organizations who have been integral to the fabric of cultural life in Minnesota and have not received the same kinds of support that our sort of the bigs receive. We named them as McKnight philanthropy experts, right? Then we said there are organizations that are on the cusp of being treasures. But if given support, investment, the opportunity to be in network with other folks, would be our new treasures. So we gave grants to those organizations. We actually funded intermediaries who then identified organizations that were sort of the next group of treasures. Then, thirdly, we said there are people, individual artists and organizations who do amazing work but haven't even had the opportunity to sort of be born. They haven't sprouted yet. That group of folks are important to support too. So this idea of, yes, supporting the organizations that have been in existence, in our case it was at least 10 years, and do important work for our place matters. But we also know that, to Lane's point earlier, we don't know everybody. Our networks, there are gaps in our networks, and it's important that we spread the opportunity out further so that, again, the ecosystem, the forests can continue to sprout and produce these treasures. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Philadelphia, also a cultural treasure city.
Yes.
Oh, good.
And we're on the same page. I think it's more just when your goals change, there are some folks who are now not included or who feel as though they're not included. And then how do you talk to those people if your criteria has shifted? And we work only in 5 counties. So it is as quick as, last year you funded us and now you've made the shift and we feel excised.
Thank you. We have 7 minutes left, and I'm determined to get to both of you guys.
Oh, I hope this is short. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Carlos Hide. My question for you all is, I'm curious about if the trust-based philanthropy project movement has changed the work that you do or your organization in itself, the mentality of the power dynamics between that as a funder to the nonprofit grantees. So I was just curious to know if that had affected the work you're all doing.
Do we want to take both questions and then respond to them?
Sure, thank you. My name is Sarah Vanderplug, and I'm here as project manager of the Chicago Musical Pathways Initiative. And I really appreciated your acknowledgement of working within a space of these large funding organizations and having to walk that balance of being an activist and being a disruptor, and how to balance that. From the perspective of someone who is working on getting more funding for work that we believe is really, really important for the future of classical music and diversifying the American orchestra, how do you recommend framing that work in how we tell the story of what we do to funders and what things to look out for in terms of how activist versus how safe to tell that story to these large organizations and how to attract funding?
Okay, 2 questions. The first is about trust-based philanthropy, and the second is really to help someone tell the story and to know whether to code switch. Is that what you're asking about? Okay, cool. Do you guys want to jump in on either of these?
I would say with regard to trust-based philanthropy, I think across the board, you'll note there's more general operating support than has been the case in the past. But I would also say that in my foundation, we also recognize that project-based support is actually quite important, especially for communities that are sort of getting their legs under them in terms of their art and cultural offerings. The idea of funding a project that has a beginning and an end so that folks can sort of begin this journey in the arts is also really important. So the idea of the pendulum swinging too far in one direction or another, I think, again, it is important to keep in mind. With regard to recommendations for how to talk to your funders, I mean, I would just say know your funder. Sort of understand where they're coming from and their orientation, and you do have to do some code switching, right? I mean, all of us do. That's a part of the being savvy about doing this work. There are some funders who you're going to really want to pop up the sort of activism, justice orientation side of your work. There are other funders who care more about your the caliber and notoriety of the artists that you're working with. So you just need to sort of understand the funder and where the funder's oriented, and then share with them such that they can connect to what you're doing and understand the value of what you're doing through their own frame.
Plus one, of course, to everything that you've offered here. You know, as a former development person who also has learned that being in philanthropy is also being a development person, which was a surprise to me when I entered the field. This idea of code switching is I don't know. Tailor your message to meet the strategy of the funder, yes. Dialogue with the funder to understand, whenever this is possible, what's really behind what's published on their website and what they're really after, and what the opportunities are for you. But while doing that, be very careful not to just chase funding or tell a story that's inauthentic to the funder. The funders can, in many instances, read that, but it does your organization a disservice. I think you want to be as candid as possible with your funders about what your real needs are and how they can be most helpful to you and why. And the trust-based philanthropy piece, yes, it's informing the way I'm thinking about the work. I would just love to do more and more and more, because it goes far beyond general support and transparency. It really has to do with handing over the power to the field.
I'll just say on a closing note that hopefully trust-based philanthropy isn't a moment. I think there was an article in Philanthropy Today, or whatever our periodicals are called, that said something about, like, what are the metrics behind trust-based philanthropy? Is it working or not? And really it's about, like, showing up as a human and actually understanding that once you move into philanthropy, you're no longer the expert. You are a conduit to capital, and that your responsibility is to listen, is to turn over reins, is to be curious, is to be proximate, is to carry community with you, is to question a lot of stuff that just gets handed down, assumptions around excellence and success. And that, there are periods of time that we will be in these roles doing that. And when we leave, what people will remember is how we showed up every day, and whether we were able to maybe make a little bit of change in how decisions are made before we left. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for the work that each of you do.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Angelique.